What was the Warsaw Pact?
The Warsaw Pact was the Eastern Bloc countries' answer to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Seeing the Western nations form a strong alliance, in May 1955 the Soviet Union and its allies met in Warsaw, Poland, where they signed a treaty agreeing that they, too, would mutually defend one another. The 8 member nations were Albania, which withdrew in 1968, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact was headquartered in Moscow and, in addition to discouraging attacks from Western Bloc/NATO countries, the organization also sought to quell any democratic uprisings in Warsaw Pact nations. But in 1990 the pact and the Soviet Union's control of it weakened. As democracy movements in member nations could not be put down. As the former Eastern Bloc countries underwent relatively peaceful revolutions, Warsaw Pact members began announcing their intentions to withdraw from the organization. East Germany withdrew when it was reunified with West Germany, and the restored Germany joined NATO, in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved by the remaining member nations in 1991.
Who were the Franks?
The Franks were another Germanic people who divided into 2 branches. The Salians, who settled near the lower Rhine River, near the North Sea. And the Ripuarians, who moved into what is now Germany, along the middle Rhine River. In 359 the Franks entered into the Roman Empire as allies, but in 481 Clovis, c. 466 to 511, gained the Silurian Frank kingship. By 486 he had begun a campaign of aggression, conquering Romans, Gauls, Visigoths, and other groups. Under this cruel and cunning king, the Franks soon controlled all of Europe from the Mediterranean to the English Channel, and from the Pyrenees Mountains to the Rhine River. Even after Clovis's death, the Franks maintained their stronghold in the region, which is how France eventually got its name. Though Clovis was a powerful ruler, he was succeeded as king of the Franks by the even more powerful Charlemagne, also called Charles the Great, 742 to 814, who ruled from 771 to 814, creating a vast empire. In 800 Pope Leo III, c. 750 to 816, crowned him Emperor of the West, thus initiating the Holy Roman Empire. It was after Charlemagne that the empire of the Franks began to break up, becoming the kingdoms of France, Germany, and Italy.
What happened in the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster?
The U.S. Space Shuttle Columbia was lost upon its re-entry into Earth's Atmosphere on the morning of February 1, 2003. All 7 crew members died. The Columbia was in the skies over Texas about 15 minutes before its scheduled landing at Florida's Kennedy Space Center when, shortly before 9 a.m. EST. Ground controllers lost data from temperature controllers on the spacecraft. Over the next several minutes, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, ground control lost all flight data. At about the same time, witnesses in Texas reported the sound of rolling thunder and debris falling from the sky. Heat detecting weather radar showed a bright red streak moving across the Texas sky. The shuttle was 40 miles above Earth and traveling at 18 times the speed of sound when it disintegrated, leaving a trail of debris from eastern Texas to western Louisiana. The investigation later revealed that damage to the spacecraft had gone unseen during the mission, causing the Columbia to break apart upon re-entry. The shuttle was commanded by Rick Husband and piloted by William McCool. The mission specialists were Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark. The payload specialist was Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon. In President George W. Bush's remarks to the nation that day, he said, "These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity." In an age when spaceflight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook the dangers of travel by rocket. These astronauts knew the dangers, and faced them willingly. The Columbia tragedy occurred within a week of the anniversaries of 2 other deadly NASA disasters. The Challenger explosion on January 28, 1986, and the launch pad fire that killed 3 Apollo astronauts on January 27, 1967. After investigating the cause of the Columbia disaster, NASA focused on implementing a new system of sensors to detect potentially fatal damage to spacecrafts while in orbit. NASA relaunched its Space Shuttle program in late July 2005 with the Discovery.
Why was the Persian Gulf War important?
The 6-week war, telecast around the world from start to finish, February-April 1991. Was significant because it was the first major international crisis to take place in the post-Cold War era. The United Nations proved to be effective in organizing the coalition against aggressor Iraq. Leading members of the coalition included Egypt, France, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the United States. The conflict also tested the ability of the United States and the Soviet Union, then still in existence as such, to cooperate in world affairs.
How was the Soviet Union formed?
The Soviet Union was officially created in 1922 when Russia joined with Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, U. SSR. These republics were later joined by 9 others, and territories were redrawn so that by 1940 the Union consisted of 15 Soviet Socialist republics: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belorussia. Now Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz, now Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldavia. Now Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, also spelled Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan.
Supreme Court decided.
Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, 1788, states that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. It goes on to describe the High Court's jurisdiction, but it does not specify how the court was to be formed or how many justices it would consist of. These matters were left to Congress, which in 1788, the year the Constitution was ratified, passed the first Judiciary Act, formulating the court's original organization. It had just 6 members, the Chief Justice, plus 5 associates. Subsequent congressional acts have modified the Supreme Court's organization and jurisdiction. Since 1869 the court has consisted of 9 members. The Chief Justice and 8 associates who, once named, serve for life. Justices are appointed by the President but must be approved by the Senate. According to Article 2 of the Constitution, to avoid partisanship, Congress is prevented from lowering the salaries of any of the justices, and justices can only be removed from the bench by impeachment. A formal document that charges a public official with misconduct. Cases reach the High Court through appeal, lower court decisions that are formally challenged, and the justices make their rulings based on a majority vote. Who was the first Chief Justice of the U.S.?
What caused the fighting in Kosovo?
The conflict in Kosovo, like that in Bosnia, was ethnic-based. Kosovo is a province at the southern end of Serbia. It neighbors Albania and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Many Albanians still live in Kosovo and see themselves more closely aligned with Albania to the southwest than with Yugoslavia. Thus, a separatist movement began, which caused mounting tension between ethnic Albanians and Serbian authorities. Early in 1998 Serbian forces and Yugoslav army units moved to suppress the Kosovo Liberation Army (KLA), the guerrilla force that sought independence for the province's Albanian population. In October Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, 1941, agreed to end the crackdown, but this was only after the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, had repeatedly threatened airstrikes. However, in the months that followed Milosevic's stated compliance there was more violence against ethnic Albanians. By January 1999, hundreds had been killed and more than 250,000 people were displaced from their homes, many of them seeking shelter in makeshift huts in the forest. Victims included the elderly, women, and children. On March 23, 1999, Yugoslav Serb parliament rejected NATO demands for autonomy in Kosovo, as well as the plan to send NATO peacekeeping troops into the troubled province. The following day, NATO launched a campaign of airstrikes against Yugoslavia, with the intent to weaken Milosevic and force him to comply with international demands to settle the conflict. After more than 50 days of airstrikes, which included some controversial and deadly errors on NATO's part, it appeared that while NATO was winning the air campaign against Yugoslavia, the Serbian government of Yugoslavia was winning a ground campaign against the Kosovar Albanians. Of the estimated 1.8 million ethnic Albanians in Yugoslavia, Milosevic's forces had driven out or killed all but 130,000. Meantime, evidence of Serb atrocities toward ethnic Albanians mounted, as mass graves were discovered and survivors who fled Kosovo reported horrific tales of torture and rape at the hands of the Serbs. Ultimately, NATO's Operation Allied Force was successful. On June 10, 1999, after a 77-day air campaign, the bombing was temporarily suspended because Yugoslav forces had begun to fully withdraw from Kosovo. The withdrawal was in compliance with an agreement drawn up between NATO and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and Republic of Serbia on the evening of June 9. By June 20, the Serb withdrawal was complete and a multinational security force was established to keep the peace. That same day, NATO announced that it had formally terminated the air campaign. NATO personnel were reassigned as peacekeepers and to move humanitarian aid, including food, water, tents, and medical supplies. Though the crisis in Kosovo was over, the aftermath was immense. It was estimated that by the end of May 1999, 1.5 million people, or 90% of the Kosovar population, had been expelled from their homes and 250,000 Kosovar men were missing. Further, there was mounting evidence that ethnic Albanians had been the victims of genocide. This evidence included the discoveries of mass graves, reports of mass executions, expulsions and rape, and the systematic destruction of property and crops. In 2003, in a peace accord brokered by the European Union, the nation of Serbia and Montenegro was established, with each republic receiving greater autonomy. The nation of Yugoslavia no longer existed.
What is common law?
It is the system of justice that prevails in Great Britain and the United States, except Louisiana, where the precedents, past decisions, of the courts are used as the basis of the legal system. It is sometimes referred to as customary law since justices consider prevailing practices customs, in order to arrive at their decisions. In the U.S., Louisiana is the only state where judges do not rely on precedent or custom to decide private cases, they rely on civil law, the letter of the code, and are free to disregard the decisions of similar cases. In all other states, the precedents must be considered. The exception of Louisiana to the prevailing system of common law is explained by its unique history. It was long a French holding, and that influence is still felt. In many countries, the justice system is a combination of the civil law handed down by the Romans under Justinian and the common law formulated in England. Private cases, often and confusingly called civil cases, are largely the realm of civil law. In other words, the statutes prevail, whereas criminal cases, in which crimes have been committed against society, are the realm of common law, i.e., decisions are based on precedent.
Who invented the vaccine?
English physician Edward Jenner, 1749 to 1823, is credited with inventing the vaccine. However, evidence suggests that vaccination, inoculation of a substance into the body for the purpose of producing active immunity against a disease, was used in China, India, and Persia, present-day Iran, in ancient times. In modern times, Jenner pioneered the science of immunology by developing a vaccination against smallpox. The English physician was practicing medicine in rural Gloucestershire in 1796 when he observed that dairymaids who had been sick with cowpox did not contract smallpox, suggesting that they had developed an immunity to the often fatal disease, which then occurred in epidemics. Jenner must have been quite certain of his theory. He chose to test it on an 8-year-old schoolboy, James Phipps, whom Jenner vaccinated with matter from cowpox vesicles from the hands of a milkmaid, Sarah Nelmes. Jenner then allowed the boy's system to develop the immunity he had previously observed in the dairymaids. Several weeks later, Jenner inoculated Phipps with smallpox, and the boy did not become even the least bit ill. The experiment was a success. Jenner continued his experiments for 2 years and then published his findings, officially announcing his discovery of vaccination in 1798. As Jenner suspected, vaccines provide immunity by causing the body to manufacture substances called antibodies, which fight a disease. Over the course of the 20th century, vaccination programs have greatly reduced disease, particularly in developed nations where childhood immunization programs are very effective. By 1977, vaccination had virtually wiped out smallpox.
What caused the Reformation?
The religious movement during the 16th century also had political and cultural causes. As more and more people were converted to Christianity during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, the Pope's sphere of influence gradually increased, giving him greater authority than many secular rulers. This supremacy was defended by Pope Innocent III, c. 1160 to 1216, one of the most prominent figures of the Middle Ages, who asserted that the Church should rightly retain its full power in both secular and spiritual matters. But in Western Europe, the monarchs became increasingly powerful as peasants began moving away from their farms and villages and to the emerging cities, which were protected by kings and emperors. The European monarchs often opposed the Pope, regarding him as a leader of a foreign state. This conflict continued for centuries. In 1309 Pope Clement V, c. 1260 to 1314, did something that would later divide the Roman Catholic Church when, being French himself, he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, where it stayed for 70 years. When Pope Gregory XI, 1329 to 1378, moved it back to Rome in 1377, some French cardinals objected and elected a pope of their own, an anti-pope, installing him at Avignon. This resulted in two popes claiming supremacy. And in 1409 the situation grew more complicated when a third pope was added in Pisa, Italy. Not only had the power struggle divided the Church, it had created tremendous confusion for the people, who further perceived that there were corrupt practices at work in the Church. These included the selling of church positions and indulgences, pardons for sins, as well as the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the bishops and the Pope, which was on a par with that of royalty. While these injustices were decried by critics, the abuses did not stop. As a remedy, some began to think that the Church should be led not by the Pope but by church councils. Dissatisfaction with the Church also extended to its message, which had turned away from God's mercy and the teachings of Jesus Christ, instead focusing on a life of good works as the way to salvation. Europe was also in the midst of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, which saw a proliferation in the number of universities, the circulation of printed materials, thanks to the advent of the movable type printing press, and broader study of classic texts as well as of the Holy Scriptures in their original languages instead of how they had been handed down in translation by the Church. Before long, a middle class of educated people emerged in Europe. These circumstances combined to bring about a period of religious reform that lasted until 1648. The movement itself, however, continued to exert influence through its emphasis on personal responsibility, individual freedom, and the secularization of society.
Who were the Khmer Rouge?
The Khmer Rouge, or Red Khmer, were a group of Cambodian communists led by radical Marxist leader Pol Pot, 1925 to 1998. Between 1970 and 1975 the Khmer Rouge guerrilla force, supported by communists from neighboring Vietnam, waged a war to topple the U.S. supported government of Lon Nol, 1913 to 1985. On April 16, 1975, Lon Nol's regime fell. And the next day the Khmer Rouge seized the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. The ruthless revolutionary leader Pol Pot became prime minister of a communist Cambodia and instituted a reign of terror. In his attempt to turn Cambodia into an agriculture-based society, the Khmer Rouge systematically emptied the cities, forcibly moving the people onto collective farms where they performed hard labor. Anyone thought to be opposed to the Khmer Rouge was killed. An estimated 2 million people died by execution, overwork, and starvation. Pol Pot's experiment had failed, and his efforts to revolutionize Cambodia amounted to nothing short of genocide. A Vietnamese invasion ousted the Khmer Rouge in 1979 and installed a new leadership. But civil wars were fought throughout the 1980s. The warring factions, who had made various alliances among themselves, finally signed a peace treaty in 1991, under the watchful eye of the United Nations. Elections were held in 1993. The resulting constitution provided for a democratic government with a limited monarchy. At that point, the Cambodian leadership seemed to come full circle with Norodom Sihanouk. 1922, being crowned king in 1993, in 1970 Sihanouk had been deposed by Lon Nol, whose regime later became the target of the Khmer Rouge. During his lifetime Sihanouk made strides in establishing Cambodia's independence, and he enjoyed great public support. Due to failing health, he abdicated the throne in November 2004 and was succeeded by his son, Norodom Sihanouk, 1953. For decades after Pol Pot was deposed, he continued to lead a revolutionary force of the Khmer in Cambodia, though he remained out of public view. His own men turned against him in early 1998, and Pol Pot died in April of that year. In December the last main fighting force of the Khmer Rouge surrendered to the Cambodian government. The event was broadcast on national television. Though some Khmer leaders remained in hiding and small bands of guerrilla fighters were thought to still exist, the radical Marxist group, which had terrorized Cambodia, no longer presented a threat to the government.
What were vassals?
In the Middle Ages, 500-1350, a vassal was anyone who was under the protection of another and therefore owed and avowed not only allegiance but a payment of some sort to their protector. Peasants, serfs and village commoners were always vassals to a lord, whether it was the lord of the manor or the lord of the fief. But the lord of the manor was himself a vassal to the lord of the fief. As kingdoms were created, with many fiefs within their jurisdiction, the feudal lords became the vassals of the kings.
Who founded the Dance Theatre of Harlem?
The Dance Theater of Harlem, the first world-renowned African-American ballet company, was founded by Arthur Mitchell, 1934, a principal dancer with the New York City Ballet. Along with Carol Schuck, 1920 to 1985, a dance teacher and former director of the Netherlands Ballet. The impetus for the creation of the company came on April 4, 1968, while Mitchell was waiting to board a plane from New York City to Brazil, where he was establishing that country's first national ballet company. And he heard that Martin Luther King Jr., 1929 to 1968, had been assassinated.
What are Nader's Raiders?
They were, and are, investigators working with American lawyer and consumer advocate Ralph Nader, 1934. With the help of his research team, Nader wrote the landmark work Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965. It charged that many automobiles weren't as safe as they should be or as consumers had the right to expect them to be. In part, the book was responsible for passage in 1966 of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which set motor vehicle safety standards. Nader has continued his watchdog work, founding the Public Citizen Organization, which researches consumer products, promotes consumer awareness, and works to influence legislators to improve consumer safety. While Nader may be the most recognizable face of consumer advocacy, the movement's roots predate his activism. As the consumer age dawned at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, when mass production techniques came into wide use, some observers decried industry standards, or lack thereof, that put the public who used their products at risk. The muckraking journalists of the early 20th century disclosed harmful or careless practices of early industry, raising awareness and bringing about needed reforms. Upton Sinclair, 1878 to 1968, for example, penned the highly influential novel The Jungle, 1906, revealing scandalous conditions of meatpacking plants. The public was outraged upon reading Sinclair's work. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, ordered an investigation, finding the novelist's descriptions to be true to life. Government moved quickly to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act that same year, 1906. Industry watchdogs continued their work in the early decades of the century. In 1929, Consumers Research Inc. was founded, and in 1936, the Consumers Union was formed. Both of these independent organizations test and rate consumer products. Consumers Union publishes its reports in the monthly magazine Consumer Reports. Such consumer advocacy has served to heighten public awareness, compelling industry to make changes and improving the safety of products in general. Abuses still occur, but at roughly 100 years into the consumer age. The work of consumer watchdogs like Nader's Raiders has made the consumer experience far less risky than it once was.
Is there an American poet laureate?
Yes, in 1985 the U.S. Congress authorized the naming of a national poet laureate. In 1986 Kentucky-born man of letters Robert Penn Warren. 1909 to 1989, became the country's first poet laureate. Among his works are the novels All the King's Men, 1946, Pulitzer Prize, and A Place to Come To. 1977, several volumes of poetry, and essays published in the anthology I'll Take My Stand, 1930. He was also the editor, 1935 to 42, of the literary journal The Southern Review. Warren's successors have included Joseph Brodsky, Mona Van Dyne, the first woman to receive the honor, and Rita Dove, the first African American to receive the honor. The complete list of poet laureates is available on the Library of Congress's website. http://www.loc.gov/poetry/laureate.html.
Why did the Russians burn Moscow?
The September 14, 1812, torching of their own city was directed by Tsar Alexander I. 1777 to 1825, who wished to prevent Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. And his invading armies from reaping the benefits of anything Russian. Through a series of wars, Napoleon had dominated most of Europe by 1805. The authority of Alexander was certainly threatened by the French emperor. In 1805 and 1807 Russia suffered major losses in battles with Napoleon's armies. In the face of these defeats, what Alexander did next was a stroke of genius. Though he had many detractors at the time, Napoleon's forces, though victorious, were weary from fighting and were unable to pursue the Russian armies further. So, Alexander made peace with the emperor in the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807. The Russian ruler vowed support of Napoleon, and for his part, Napoleon believed Alexander had extended him a hand of friendship. Instead, the cunning Russian ruler had bought himself and his country the time they needed to gird themselves against powerful Napoleon. By 1812 Russia, its economy dependent on exports, resumed trade with Great Britain, Napoleon's archenemy. This prompted the return of Napoleon's troops to Russia. Later that year the French emperor marched into Russia with a force of as many as 600,000 men, but the Russians still delivered Napoleon a crushing defeat. The Russian army had relied on guerrilla warfare tactics, including burning their own countryside. Napoleon returned to Paris in defeat by the end of the year.
Were activists the only ones who were vocal about opposing segregation?
No, segregation was opposed at every level of black society, as well as by many whites. The voices of the civil rights movement included wage laborers, farmers, educators, athletes, entertainers, soldiers, religious leaders, politicians, and statesmen, all of whom had experienced the oppression of Jim Crow laws and policies in the United States. Before W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, rose to prominence as an educator and writer, he chose to leave the security of his home in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, to attend college at Nashville's Fisk University. There, in 1885, he encountered Tennessee's Jim Crow laws, which strictly divided blacks and whites. He was so intimidated by the Southern system that he rarely left the campus, and he ultimately returned to New England to complete his studies at Harvard University. He did, however, go back to the South, becoming a professor of economics and history at Atlanta University, 1897 to 1910, 1932 to 44. As one of the first exponents of full and equal racial equality. In 1909, Du Bois helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which provided leadership during the Civil Rights Movement. In 1942, a young Georgia man named John Roosevelt Robinson, 1919 to 1972, was drafted into the military. Robinson applied for officers' candidate school at Fort Riley, Kansas. And although he was admitted to the program, he and the other black candidates received no training until pressure from Washington, D.C., forced the local commander to admit blacks to the base's training school. Later Robinson became a second lieutenant and continued to challenge the Jim Crow policies on military bases. When the Army decided to keep him out of a game with the nearby University of Missouri because that school refused to play against a team with black members, Robinson quit the base's football team in protest. At Fort Hood, Texas, Robinson objected to segregation on an Army bus. His protests led to court-martial. Acquitted, in November 1944 Robinson was honorably discharged before the end of World War II. 1939 to 45 The Army had no desire to keep this black agitator among the ranks. And, as Robinson later put it, he was pretty much fed up with the service. In 1947 Jackie Robinson became the first black baseball player in the major leagues, when he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers, breaking the color barrier in the national pastime. In the post-war years, American diplomat Ralph Bunche, 1904 to 1971, attracted public attention when he rejected an offer from President Harry Truman, 1884 to 1972, to become an Assistant Secretary of State. Bunche, a Howard University professor who had worked for the Office of Strategic Services during the war, explained that he declined the position because he did not want to subject his family to the Jim Crow laws of Washington, D.C. Bunche spoke out frequently against racism, and in 1944 he co-authored the book An American Dilemma, which examined the plight of American blacks. These are just a few of the many examples of personal protest that signaled the beginning of the civil rights movement in the United States.
When was the first human organ transplant?
The first human organ transplant occurred on June 17, 1950, at the Little Company of Mary Hospital in Evergreen Park, Illinois. The suburban Chicago hospital, better known as the Baby Hospital for the high number of births there each year, was an unlikely place for this landmark in medical history. And the doctors who took part in the transplant tried to keep the highly experimental procedure quiet. The subject was a 44-year-old woman who suffered from polycystic kidney disease. She received a donor organ, a kidney, from a cadaver, making the procedure even more controversial for the Catholic hospital. At the time, the Church was opposed to the idea that tissue could be taken from a dead person and put into a living person, and that the tissue would then come to life again. But the three doctors who performed the procedure had the confidence and trust of the sisters running the hospital. Doctors James W. West, Richard H. Lawler, and Raymond P. Murphy were surgeons on the faculty at Loyola Strick School of Medicine and the Cook County Hospital, but also practiced at Little Company of Mary. The operation was the last resort for the patient, who had seen her mother, sister, and uncle die from the same disease. Word leaked about the operation, and several days after the procedure, when the patient was doing well, the hospital and doctors went public with their breakthrough, making headlines around the world. The transplanted kidney functioned in the patient for about 6 weeks, enough time for her other kidney to begin working again. She lived another 5 years before finally succumbing to the disease. On December 23, 1954, Harvard University physicians led by surgeon Joseph E. Murray, 1919, performed the world's first successful transplant from a living donor, the patient's identical twin brother. The operation took place at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, now Brigham and Women's Hospital. Since the patient and the donor had the same genetic makeup, organ rejection was not an issue. The procedure saved the patient's life, and the well-publicized breakthrough immediately opened up the possibility for similar transplants, between identical twins, as well as for the transplantation of other organs. Dr. Murray and other Harvard researchers continued working on the problem of rejection, eventually developing new drugs that reduce the possibility that a recipient would reject an organ from a non-relative. In 1990, Murray was awarded the Nobel Prize for his pioneering work. He shared the prize with his friend and colleague E. Donald Thomas, 1920, an innovator in bone marrow transplant. Today, tens of thousands of organs are transplanted each year in the United States. In October 2004, doctors performed the first organ transplant arranged and brokered over the Internet.
What was the Atlantic Charter?
On the eve of direct U.S. involvement in World War II, 1939–45, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. 1874–1965, on board a ship off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. There the two leaders drew up a program of peace objectives known as the Atlantic Charter, which they signed on August 14, 1941. In addition to other peacetime goals, the charter roughly contained Roosevelt's four freedoms, which he had outlined in his speech to Congress on January 6, 1941. As the legislative body considered passage of the Lend-Lease Act, Roosevelt believed that freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear should prevail around the world. Briefly, in the Atlantic Charter the two leaders stated that neither of their countries sought new territories, that they respected the right of the people of each country to choose their own form of government, that no country, great or small, victor or vanquished, would be deprived access to the raw materials it needed for its own economic prosperity, that countries should cooperate to improve labor standards and social security, that after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want, and that a wider and permanent system of general security would be necessary to ensure peace. This last statement alludes to the future establishment of the United Nations.
What is the Mars rover?
The Mars rover is a National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, project launched in June 2003 and that landed on the Red Planet in January 2004. Two rovers, named Spirit and Opportunity, were designed to be robotic geologists, collecting data as they roam the surface of Mars. Each robot has features that NASA described as similar to what any living creature would need during exploration: a body, or structure, to protect the rover's vital organs, brains, or computers, to process information; temperature controls, including internal heaters and insulation to protect the structure from the elements; a neck and head, or a mast for the cameras to give the rovers a human-scale view, eyes and other senses; or cameras and instruments that give the rovers information about their environment, wheels and legs for mobility, arms for reaching, and the ability to communicate, via antennas for speaking and listening. The rovers are powered by batteries and solar panels. Since the first data began to be returned to Earth in early March 2004, the rovers have provided scientists with data and impressive images for research and study. A dramatic finding from the twin rovers was the discovery that the arid planet had once been wet and possibly habitable, based on data collected by Opportunity. Researchers concluded that liquid water was once intermittently present at the Martian surface. Observers can track the progress of Spirit and Opportunity, each exploring different areas of the red planet. At the NASA website, http://marsrovers.jpl.nasa.gov/home-index.html.
How is the attitude of the Renaissance characterized?
The artists and thinkers of the Renaissance, like the ancient Greeks and Romans, valued earthly life, glorified man's nature, and celebrated individual achievement. These new attitudes combined to form a new spirit of optimism. The belief that man was capable of accomplishing great things. This outlook was the result of the activities of the wealthy mercantile class in northern Italy, who, aside from supporting the arts and letters, also began collecting the classical texts that had been forgotten during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. Ancient manuscripts were taken to libraries, where scholars from around Europe could study them. The rediscovery of classical texts prompted a new way of looking at the world. During the Middle Ages, scholars argued that the meaning of life on earth lay primarily in its relation to an afterlife. Therefore, they believed that art for its own sake had no value. And they even frowned on the recognition of individual talent. For this reason, many of the great works of the Middle Ages were created anonymously or were hidden from public view. In contrast, Renaissance artists and thinkers studied classical works for the purpose of imitating them. As an expression of their new optimism, Renaissance scholars embraced the study of classical subjects that addressed human, rather than scientific, concerns. These humanities, as they came to be called, included language and literature, art, history, rhetoric, and philosophy. Above all, humanists, those who espoused the values of this type of education, believed in man's potential to become well versed in many areas. Thus, a Renaissance man is anyone whose talents span a variety of disciplines. During the Renaissance, people in all disciplines began using critical skills as a means of understanding everything from nature to politics.
How did Betty Friedan's feminine mystique launch the modern women's rights movement?
American author and activist Betty Friedan's 1921 landmark work was published in 1963. She argued that in the post-war era American society expected women only to be devoted housewives and mothers. This was the ideal, the mystique, that was both promoted and accepted. In the feminine mystique, Friedan challenged this prevailing notion, causing many women to re-examine their lives. After all, during World War II, 1939-45, women had ably stepped into the workplace to keep industry running as the men went to war. When the servicemen came back, women returned to the home and were not expected to seek careers.
What is the system of scientific management?
A system to gain maximum efficiency from workers and machinery, scientific management. Also known as Taylorism, was developed by American industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor, 1856 to 1915. As foreman in a steel plant, Taylor undertook time and motion studies and conducted experiments to determine the one best way to do any given job, developing detailed systems to yield the highest possible productivity levels. He first presented his theories in 1903 to the American Academy of Mechanical Engineers. Efficiency was the cornerstone of Taylorism. Production processes should not waste time or materials. He published his ideas in the landmark work The Principles of Management, 1911. And became a well-known engineering consultant, contracted by companies eager to maximize their output. The doctrine of scientific management was embraced by American industry. As transportation networks improved and the U.S. population grew rapidly in the early 1900s, markets expanded, placing great demands on industry. Applying Taylor's scientific management, manufacturers were able to boost productivity by as much as 200%. Since Taylorism broke production processes into individual tasks, each with its own best practice, new workers could be quickly and easily trained, which adherents believed was another benefit of the concept. Scientific management had many advocates, including engineers Frank, 1868 to 1924, and Lillian, 1878 to 1972, Gilbreth, who furthered Taylor's work, publishing volumes such as Primer of Scientific Management. 1911, Psychology of Management, 1912, and Studies on Motion, Fatigue, and Time. Among those who applied scientific management were Ford Motor Company, in developing the assembly line for the Model T. Boston retailer Fillings, one of the first commercial enterprises to use the method. And Bethlehem Steel, which conducted experiments in the loading of pig iron. Scientific management also had its detractors. Taylorism was criticized for having a dehumanizing effect on labor. In making every job routine, some charged that the system separated the minds of workers from their hands, eliminated the need for skilled workers, and gave management absolute control over production processes. Nevertheless, principles of scientific management remain evident in the workplace today. And the adoption of scientific management is credited with boosting American productivity and increasing stockholder profits. Theories concerning worker output were modified during the second half of the 20th century.
Which Van Eyck Hubert or Jan painted the Ghent altarpiece?
The large, multi-paneled altarpiece is as controversial as it is admired. The controversy stems from an 1832 discovery, under a coat of paint on one of its outside panels, of a Latin poem that indicated that Hubert, 1395 to 1441, had begun the work and Jan c. 1370 to 1426, had completed it. So it was believed that the Ghent altarpiece, 1432, was a collaboration between the Flemish brothers. But the question of attribution continued to puzzle art historians for a century and a half, as attempts to assign different parts of the polyptych multi-paneled work to either of the brothers failed to gain acceptance. One art historian suggested that Hubert may not have been a painter at all, but rather a sculptor. This theory posited that Hubert's contribution was only in crafting the frames from which the paintings had been removed in 1566 and which were subsequently lost. However, scholars seem to have now reached the consensus that Hubert was largely responsible for the design of the altarpiece and for much of its execution, while Jan was the designer and painter of most of the figures. This elaborate altarpiece, which is composed of 20 folding panels, was typical of Northern European art during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. However, both Van Eyck's contributed to the flowering of Renaissance art in Northern Europe as well. In Jan's works, which are finely detailed and ornamental, he was originally a miniaturist and illuminator. The progression from medieval to Renaissance art can be seen. In particular, his painting Man in a Red Turban, 1433, which may be a self-portrait, marks an important step in the humanization of art. Prior to this, the artist's subjects had been religious in nature. Here the painting is simply a record of a living individual. This kind of portraiture began to multiply as artists and patrons alike became increasingly interested in the reality revealed by them. Through such portraits, man began to confront himself rather than the otherworldly anonymity of the Middle Ages. Renaissance art in Italy as well as in Northern Europe marks the climax of the slow but mighty process that brings man's eyes down from the supernatural to the natural world, Gardner's art through the ages.
How many musical backs were there?
Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750, was only one of a long and extended line of competent musicians, some 14 of them. The Bach family was a musical dynasty. JS's father, Ambrosius Bach, 1645 to 1695, was a court musician for the Duke of Eisenach, and several of J.S. Bach's close relatives were organists in churches. His eldest brother, Johann Christoph Bach, 1671 to 1721, was apprenticed to the famous German composer Johann Pachelbel. 1653 to 1706, J.S. Bach left a musical legacy even beyond the vast body of church, vocal, and instrumental music that he composed. 4 of his sons and 1 grandson were also accomplished musicians. The English Bach refers to J.S.'s son Johann Christian Bach, 1735 to 1782. Who composed operas, oratorios, arias, cantatas, symphonies, concertos, and chamber music. A proponent of Rococo-style music, J.C. Bach influenced Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756 to 1791.
When were antibiotics invented?
The idea of antibiotics, substances that destroy or inhibit the growth of certain other microorganisms, dates back to the late 19th century. But the first antibiotics were not produced until well into the 20th century. The great French chemist Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, laid the foundation for understanding antibiotics when in the late 1800s he proved that one species of microorganisms can kill another. German bacteriologist Paul Ehrlich, 1854 to 1915, then developed the concept of selective toxicity, in which a specific substance can be toxic, poisonous, to some organisms but harmless to others. Based on this research, scientists began working to develop substances that would destroy disease-spreading microorganisms. A breakthrough came in 1928 when Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming, 1881 to 1955, discovered penicillin. Fleming observed that no bacteria grew around the mold of the genus Penicillium notatum, which had accidentally fallen into a bacterial culture in his laboratory. But penicillin proved difficult to extract. It was not until more than a decade later, in 1941, that the substance was purified and tested by British scientist Howard Florey, 1898 to 1968. Another British scientist, Ernst Boris Chain, 1906 to 1979, developed a method of extracting penicillin. And under his supervision the first large-scale penicillin production facility was completed, making the antibiotic commercially available in 1945. That same year, Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work in discovering and producing the powerful antibiotic, still used today in the successful treatment of bacterial diseases, including pneumonia, strep throat, and gonorrhea. The term antibiotic was coined by American microbiologist Selman A. Waxman, 1888 to 1973, who tested about 10,000 types of soil bacteria for antibiotic capability. In 1943 Waxman discovered a fungus that produced a powerful antibiotic substance, which he called streptomycin. The following year, the antibiotic was in production for use in treating tuberculosis, typhoid fever, bubonic plague, and bacterial meningitis. Although streptomycin was later found to be toxic, it saved countless lives and led to the discovery of many other antibiotics, which have proven both safe and effective.
Who was Biko?
Stephen Biko, 1946 to 1977, was a black leader in the fight against South African apartheid and white minority rule. In 1969 Biko, who was then a medical student, founded the South African Students' Organization, which took an active role in the Black Consciousness movement, a powerful force in the fight against apartheid. Preaching a doctrine of black self-reliance and self-respect. Biko organized protests, including anti-government strikes and marches. Viewing such activities as a challenge to its authority and fearing an escalation of unrest. In August 1977, the white government had Biko arrested. Within 1 month, he died in prison. Evidence indicated he had died at the hands of his jailers. A revelation that only cemented anti-government sentiment. Along with Nelson Mandela, 1918, who was imprisoned in South Africa from 1962 to 1990 for his political activities, Biko became a symbol of the anti-apartheid movement, galvanizing support for racial justice at home and abroad.
What were the 5-year plans?
These were the plans initiated by Premier Joseph Stalin. 1879 to 1953, of the Soviet Union to speed industrialization of the USSR.
How many popes have there been?
The number given by the Vatican is 265, including Pope Benedict XVI. The former German cardinal who was elected on April 19, 2005, to succeed John Paul II, 1920 to 2005. Other lists cite 266 popes. The discrepancy arises around Stephen II, who died in 752 after he was elected but before he could be consecrated. Except for a few brief interruptions when the papacy was vacant. The Roman Catholic Church has been led by the Pope as its visible head, and Jesus Christ as its invisible head. Since Jesus said to the Apostle Peter, "And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it," Matthew 16:18. The Apostle Peter, who was earlier called Simon and is also called Simon. Peter became the leader of the Christian community after the crucifixion of Christ. And he made Jerusalem the headquarters of his preaching in Palestine. According to 2nd century sources, Peter traveled to Rome about 55 AD and became the city's first bishop. During the persecution of Christians under Roman Emperor Nero, 37 to 68 AD, Peter was crucified on Vatican Hill in the year 64. He died a martyr and was canonized. St. Peter's Church, the principal church of the Christian world, is said to have been built over Peter's burial place. These events in Rome during St. Peter's time long after gave the city special status within the church. It further established the site of the Papal Palace in Vatican City, which is an independent state that lies within the city of Rome. And the majority of popes, all but 18, have been Italian, when John Paul II, who was born in Poland, was elected Pope in 1978, he was the first non-Italian Pope since 1523.